So thanks everyone for participating in our first early adopter onboarding session. I'm Paul Self, Basis co-founder, and I'm joined today by Dr. Dan Patterson, our CEO and founder of Basis. So we've structured the early adopter program a little bit differently than what many of you may have experienced in the past. So the purpose of these onboarding sessions is to prepare this team for trialing and using Basis inside of your own organizations. We're very anxious to hear your feedback, and we'll be sending a survey at the conclusion of each one of the onboarding sessions for you to give us that feedback. In addition, during the sessions, please use the chat feature included in the GoToMeeting to ask questions, and we'll do our best to get to those either in real time or at the conclusion of the session. For any questions that we don't get to, we're happy to reply via email specifically to each of you. Today's session is going to be focused on top-down planning. So Dan is going to help us understand why within Basis we believe differentiating between scope and work is an important component to the planning process. So we'll start with that top-down plan, defining the scope, breaking it down into planning packages, and then sequencing those planning packages in a way that's logical for the time frame that we have for our project. We'll also explore the knowledge library and its role in building out our plans, even at this very early stage in the planning process. In subsequent weeks, we're going to actually walk through additional feature sets and sections and pieces of the process in building a Basis plan. Next week, we'll focus on bottoms-up planning, specifically building the plan and taking those planning packages and identifying and defining the work and the activities that sit within each one of those. From there, we'll actually talk about capturing consensus and getting the expert opinion of our team members that may not be planning engineers or people that have even logged into a CPM tool in the past. The key to that component in the process is making sure we make it easy and fast for those individuals to log in, assess the plan, and give us their feedback. And then finally, in our final session, we'll review and baseline that plan. So we'll take the plan that we built, the team member feedback, and the consensus we've gained from the team. We'll incorporate that into our plan and flatten it into its own singular, unique baseline that's then ready for project execution. So again, please ask questions throughout using the chat feature. And with that, Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. So, Paul, as you alluded, the focus today is really all about top-down planning and the very distinct differentiation that we're making within the Basis product between deliverables and scope and the work required to achieve and deliver those deliverables on time and to budget. So before we get into the details around that top-down planning aspect of the product, for those of you that perhaps haven't seen or heard of Basis before, I think it's probably worth spending a couple of minutes just giving you a high-level overview as to the workflow within the product. The product itself is really based or built on a three-step workflow: build, validate, deliver. The building aspect is really a combination of top-down planning, identifying our deliverables and our expected timelines, and then marrying that up, doing a bottoms-up planning approach, taking more of a traditional CPM planning perspective where we're building activities with logic links and calendars, so on and so forth. That plan is then validated through the team member consensus, and then that consensus is reviewed, moving us more towards the delivery part, which is our calibrated, validated, more realistic, achievable plan. So let me just very quickly show you that three-step workflow in the product, and then we'll dive into the top-down planning. So I'm going to go ahead and log into Basis in my web browser, and you can see as a project owner, I am immediately presented with a dashboard of the projects that I am currently active within. And I can see, for example, at the top here, I have various metrics pertaining to things such as how much buy-in or pushback are my team members giving me on the expected timelines, how well is my plan aligned to my expected deliverables, how much detail do I have in the plan, and have I planned out sufficiently against the WBS elements, and a new type of measurement within project scheduling, what we're calling continuity. And that is a measure of how continuous is our work. It's one thing to have, for example, a critical path or a driving path within a network, but if there are gaps within that network, perhaps because of lags on relationships, for example, then there is opportunity to compress and accelerate a schedule. So we believe it's very, very important to have as continuous as possible paths through your project network. Let's take a look at our project in a little bit more detail. You'll notice at the top we have 4 navigational elements. This is our top-down defining scope, our bottoms-up building plan, and then a view for submitting markup and feedback to the project planner or the lead planner, and then a view for consolidating all of that feedback. In all of the views, there is commonality with regards to the user interface. On the right-hand side, we have what we call the iris window. And the iris window is a means for, again, either a project planner or a team member to not only interface with the plan and submit information, but this window is also used for basis to actually provide information back to me as a team member. So it's very much a two-directional, bi-directional interface. So here we have our scope view. We can see we have a WBS structure. We have what we call planning packages and work packages, and I'll elaborate on those a little bit later on. There's an example here under phase 2 where we have a discontinuous scope of work. We have a gap in between phase 2, so that's a graphical indication there that we could actually backfill that deliverable with additional scope within the center section there. The build plan view is more of a traditional CPM type environment. This is the view where, again, a lead planner or a planner will start to build out the details in the project schedule, defining various types of logic within the plan, applying things such as constraint dates within the schedule, defining durations. I'll touch in the onboarding session in a few minutes, I'll touch on what we call smart planning, but we've introduced many new concepts to accelerate and partially automate the building and the fleshing out of a schedule. So rather than having to create 1,000 activities from scratch by hand, you can now use, for example, the flesh out feature or go to the knowledge library and pull in subnets from your organizational standards, things like that. The markup view is a very simple view designed for team members, and the purpose of this view is to present the team member that doesn't necessarily need or want to understand the complexities of a CPM schedule, but instead has that knowledge as to how to build what we're building in the project. So the idea in the markup view is that as a team member, first of all, I get a highly filtered list of things that just pertain or ascertain to me. Secondly, I have a very, very simple choice to make when reviewing the work that I'm being asked to provide markup on. And those two choices you can see on the right-hand side are quite simply either do I accept the duration of the activity in question, or do I not believe that that duration and sequence and date is correct, in which case I can make a suggestion as to what I believe it is, and I can then go ahead and submit that change. Now that change or that suggestion then gets reviewed during the consolidate process. So as the lead planner then reviews the various contributions, they can then see that, for example, Dan Patterson here, a contributor, made a suggestion as to what the duration should be, when the start date should be, other team members have also given their expertise or their expert opinion, I, as the lead planner, then get to make an informed decision as to which of those individuals' opinion I take into account. I can even do things like take the consensus of all of the contributors and then push that back to my plan. So really the whole purpose of that workflow that I've just outlined is to, first of all, establish our top-down expected timelines, to then backfill that timeline with our detailed plan, take that plan then and interview and ask the team members, the project as a whole, as to whether they believe the durations, the sequence is correct, and then to take that expert opinion and bring it back during the consolidation process. So over the next 4 sessions, we'll be touching on each of those 4 elements of the workflow. So going back to the top-down planning aspect, what I'd like to spend a few minutes on this morning is introducing the concept of deliverable-based planning, and also share with you things like the knowledge library, which is really an accelerator to building our deliverable-based or our scope-based plan. So we'll touch on things like establishing our scope hierarchy, the concept of planning packages, detailing out the work breakdown structure, again, pulling from the knowledge library, but also being able to push back to the knowledge library as well, being able to share our knowledge with other projects. Defining timelines for work breakdown structures. This is a new concept, or a concept that's different from that in traditional CPM scheduling tools. While I strongly believe it's useful to be able to define a work breakdown structure hierarchy as you can in, for example, Primavera P6, what you cannot do today in a traditional CPM tool is assign an expected timeline to that WBS structure. You have to add activities and logic, so on and so forth, and then the WBSs simply reflect the durations. Well, I think that's actually backwards, and I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. Tied to that, we're also introducing the concept of not just establishing targets and forecasts, but actually tracking against those targets and forecasts through the use of what we call basis dates and planning windows. So before we dive back into the product, just a little bit of theory around the concept of planning packages. So think of a planning package as the lowest level item in a work breakdown structure. Now, you may be wondering, well, okay, so what? Well, the so what is that a planning package does not contain any activities within it. So it's very different to a WBS element that you have in a scheduling tool, where you may have a couple of activities underneath, but then that WBS element, again, grows or shrinks based on the work that it's containing. The benefit of using a planning package is that you can define an expected duration for that deliverable. You don't have to introduce complexities like logic. You don't have to create tasks or activities. It's purely an expected timeline. Then, as planning packages get detailed out and work is introduced, activities and tasks in your plan, that planning package then turns into a work package. So a work package is a deliverable that has work assigned to it. And then, of course, a WBS is a parent item that can have either a combination of planning packages or work packages within it. So let's go ahead now and walk through the creation of a deliverable-based plan. So we're doing our top-down planning, and further introduce the concept of planning packages. So within Basis, I'm going to play the role of a lead planner. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, and I'm immediately taken to what we call the define scope view. So a couple of different ways in which I can start to build out my deliverable-based plan. The first approach is really it's a manual approach whereby I can start adding planning packages to my project, and I simply do that by clicking on the planning package icon in the grid here. Now, once I've applied those planning packages, let's go ahead and describe them. Let's call this initiation And the second planning package we will call concept select. Once I've identified or defined those planning packages, I can then define not only their durations interactively in the Gantt chart, but I can also move them around with respect to time. So this is very, very different to the concept of a WBS in, again, Primavera or Microsoft Project. So another way of building out my deliverable-based plan with the use of planning packages is to start taking advantage of what we call smart planning. So rather than manually creating our two planning packages here, I can go over to the smart planning section on the right-hand side, and within the flesh out tab here, I have the ability to automate the generation of additional planning packages. So in this example, I can say, okay, I would like to create 3 planning packages in sequence rather than in parallel. I want those planning packages to automatically calculate with regards to duration. And I'm going to go ahead and just hit flesh out. And Basis now, you'll see, has automatically added those 3 planning packages. So we could very quickly describe these as engineering, procurement, and of course, construction. And again, I can manually manipulate or designate timing, sequence, and durations simply by interacting in the Gantt chart or through the iris window on the right-hand side. So it's very, very fast and easy to create our planning packages. We can also create hierarchies within those planning packages simply by interacting as we did previously.
So Dan, a quick question. Is there a way to then change the duration for that whole section of planning packages I may have just created?
So there is, yeah, and there's a couple of levels at which I can do that. So let's take the example here where I have my initiation scope and I've got my 2 planning packages within initiation. I can take advantage of the factor smart planning, and within here I can say for the whole of initiation I'd like to factor down the durations by 20%, in which case it will reduce the durations. It's also reduced the parent WBS automatically as well. And I can apply that factorization at any level within my project. I could, if I chose to, even do it at the project root level, in which case every element within the project will be factored.
Okay, that makes sense. So I know we're not going into building the plan today. We're focusing on defining the scope elements, but how do I create a work package?
How do you create a work package? Okay, great question. So everything I've showed so far is really pertaining to creating the planning packages. Now, you believe it or not, you actually cannot manually create a work package. And the reason is a planning package automatically becomes a work package when work is assigned to that planning package. So let me show you a quick example of that. So if I were in the build plan view, this is where I'm doing my bottoms up planning, creating activities, so on and so forth. If I went to, say, our procurement planning package, and again, just to make it easy on myself, I'm going to go ahead and create 4 activities, and I want them to sit within the planning package start and end period. I'll just hit flesh out. So now I have 4 activities in sequence. They're automatically logic linked, and they fill the duration of what was that planning package. You'll notice now that planning package, instead of being a hollow gray rectangle, is now a solid gray rectangle. It's because that planning package is now automatically a work package. And if I then extend out the duration of, say, one of the activities within that work package, the work package automatically grows, whereas a planning package is still, it's a forecast. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Okay, so what I've showed you so far is either manual creation of planning packages or more of an automated approach using things like the flesh out within smart planning. What I'd now like to introduce is another capability within Basis for both faster generation of our deliverable-based plan, but I think more importantly, a more realistic, accurate, and repeatable deliverable-based plan as well. So we do that through the use of what we call the knowledge library. So within BASIS, there is a knowledge library that is shared amongst all of the projects within your organization. And within that knowledge library, your organization can store a combination of historical projects, it can be previous as-builts, it can be templates, it can be a library of subnets, it can be benchmarks, it can even be things such as risk register templates, common issues. So you can start to build up and capture knowledge, not just with regards to duration and dates, but it can be rates, costs, as I said, risks, issues, so on and so forth. So the idea is that as you're doing your top-down planning, then you can call upon the knowledge library and say, okay, well, I'm building out my engineering scope. This is a similar project to one that I've worked on previously, or I'd like to see whether within our organization we have standard benchmarks for this type of engineering. You can then pull that WBS structure with planning packages from the knowledge library into your project and then work from it there going forwards. Now, what you can also do within your project is if you've spent the time defining and building out your WBS structure and your planning packages, you can also publish that back to the knowledge library so that other projects can then subscribe to it. So you're effectively sharing your knowledge as you build the plan. So let me show you an example of that. So before we interrogate the knowledge library, let me just show you the knowledge library itself. So the knowledge library contains what we call knowledge chapters. So the orange containers here are knowledge chapters. So we have a section of verified knowledge and unverified, and then within, for example, verified, we have different business units, and then we have different standards and templates and benchmarks within each of those. So with that, let's go back into our project. And we were in the define scope view. And Paul, earlier I showed you how we fleshed out procurement with a couple of activities, but let's go back to our engineering scope, which right now is nothing more than a single planning package. And I'm going to go ahead back into smart planning, but this time I'm going to go to the library. Now, the library section here is a summary of the knowledge library. And what it allows me to do is effectively do a very, very clever lookup. So if I'm interested in engineering, then you would think, well, perhaps I'm just going to type engineering. And I absolutely could, and it would come back with all scope elements with regards to engineering. But it's actually a lot smarter than that, because if in the knowledge base, engineering scope has common risks or risks associated with it, I can even do a search for a risk. The knowledge library will come back and say, well, here are the areas of scope which that risk typically impacts. So it's a very, very clever way of doing a lookup. So I'm going to go ahead and simply type in the word benchmark. And the knowledge library is saying, well, okay, I've got some benchmarking for you with regards to North America engineering rates. So I'm going to say, okay, I'd like to take a look at that. So within that engineering scope, within my knowledge library, I've got structural, mechanical, electrical, so on and so forth. So I get the flexibility of saying, well, I'd like to preview that. I'd like to see what that looks like. So I can go ahead and preview it within my deliverable-based plan. And you'll notice now within our engineering scope, this is the elements that it's brought in. And again, once I've brought this in, if I'm comfortable with structural, but perhaps mechanical is a little bit aggressive in my mind, I can manually, again, interact with the planning packages. So I'm now building on the core knowledge that I pulled from the knowledge library.
Okay, so once I've brought that information in from the library, can I factor it in the same way that I did when I manually created the WBS?
Okay, so I think what you're asking there, Paul, is okay, I've showed you how to manually update the scope that I brought in, but can I use the same type of factoring approach that we saw earlier when we were manually creating scope?
Right.
Yes, so I would simply click on, let's say we'll click on my engineering WBS, I'd go back to factor, and it works in exactly the same way. So I could factor down that whole engineering scope by 10%. And what I would probably do as well is I would probably annotate it and say, okay, the reason why I did that was, let's put in factored down by 10% due to Texas rates. Okay, so that scope element, that whole scope now has a tag associated with it that explains why I factored it down. It also, you'll notice here, has some risks. These risks were risks that were already in the knowledge base that came over during my pulling from the knowledge library. Okay, now what I could also do is say, well, now that I've factored this up, I've applied some changes, I actually would like to contribute back to the knowledge library. I believe this is a more representative model of my engineering scope. So I can go back to the library and say, I would actually like to send this back now and share it with other projects. I made some changes, I factored, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead now and share that. And now that knowledge is actually sitting within, if I go back to the knowledge library, I will see that Dan's engineering benchmarks are now sitting within the knowledge base.
Did so Dan, do the risks and the comments that I make get published into the knowledge base as well?
Yeah, so as I did the publish there, everything pertaining to that segment of scope, whether it's risks, issues, action items, do actually end up going back into the knowledge base, yes.
Okay, so that's great. And then if I were a different planner, could I still take advantage of that new information that you published to the knowledge library to kind of recalibrate my own plan?
Okay, so yeah, again, the simple answer is yes. Let me show you. So if you don't mind, Paul, I'm actually going to pretend I'm you now. So in a different machine, I'm going to log into Basis as Paul, the second planner. And Paul, you're going to go ahead and create another project. We'll call it Paul's project. And you could do exactly what I was doing earlier. Let's say this is your engineering element here, and you want to now interrogate the knowledge library. Okay. Well, lo and behold, look, you can even search for things like, you remember I created a risk called, it was not a risk, it was a tag as to why I factored down the rates by 10%.
Okay.
So I said it was due to Texas rates. I can hit the keyword Texas, and lo and behold, look, there's the scope element that I shared with the knowledge library, and boom, there it is in your project.
Excellent.
And to answer your question from earlier, these are all the risks, not only that came from the knowledge library, but the ones that I added as well. So yes.
Perfect.
So what I've demonstrated so far is the creation of our deliverable-based plan, but really I've been doing it in isolation of other contributors. So one of the very, very key capabilities within Basis is the ability to delegate and share the task of planning. And we can do that in one of two ways. We can delegate down the planning process to, for example, Paul the planner, but we can also assign markup responsibility to the team as a whole. So in that example, Paul, I'm working on my engineering, procurement, construction scope. I've detailed out engineering and procurement. I want you as the construction guru to flesh out the construction scope. So I'm going to delegate you as my construction planner. You then have the responsibility of going off and defining construction scope. That's very different to me saying, okay, for my engineering scope, I would like Chris and Melissa and Jackie and Pete to all give me their feedback as to whether they believe my forecast for engineering is realistic or not. So we're very flexible in either delegating down ownership of sub chunks of work of scope, or is it really we've defined that chunk and now we want feedback on it? Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Okay. Well, let me then show you a quick example of that as well. So let's go back to our scope view, and let's just run through the example I just mentioned. So let's say, for example, Paul, I want you to flesh out the planning packages for the construction area of the schedule. So what I would do is I would delegate down. Now, before I do that, of course, I have to invite users to my project. So I'm very quickly going to invite yourself, Melissa, and Chris, make you all contributors to the project. So now, under construction, I would simply say, okay, Paul, I want you to be the owner of construction, and off you go.
So Dan, when you did that and when you were adding me as a delegated planner, I also saw the option to invite non-Basis users. Can people that aren't currently users of Basis be assigned to a project?
Yeah, so one of the nice capabilities of the tool is that if you are working in an environment, perhaps you're an owner organization and you're working with multiple EPCs, or maybe you have joint venture partners, as a project owner or perhaps a lead planner, you can even invite non-organizational members. So it's very, very flexible. And of course, because we don't charge or license by team member, a project can have an unlimited number of contributors, irrespective of whether they are within the organization or perhaps, as I said, part of an external organization. So yes.
So I could have my team member community be individuals inside of my company or outside of my company and still get their contribution to the plan. And as a team member, they can buy in, they can push back, but I can actually track that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned the word contributing. That's the markup process, and then the tracking is the consolidating, the reviewing that we'll absolutely dive into in the second and third sessions.
Very good.
So just to close off on our example, Paul, I made you the construction manager here. I'd like you to go ahead and flesh out the construction scope. Before you can do that, I first of all have to enable what we call the review cycle. So right now I have total control of my plan, and what I'm about to say is, okay, please flesh out scope and give feedback on risks, etc. I could, if I chose to, limit the forecast time for which I'd like you to plan out. So if we were working under what we call rolling wave planning, Paul, and let's say we were just detailing out the next 90 days, I could just set the window for 90 days. You would then know, and you'd be informed graphically in the tool, that I'm not asking you to flesh out the next 5 years worth of scope. I'm only asking you to detail the next 90 days worth.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead now and start the review cycle. So what that means now, Paul, is, again, if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump back to your computer and play you now. Okay.
Okay.
So here's the project that we created. And if I go to the define scope view, you'll see the same scope elements that I was working on earlier. So there was our scope from the knowledge library. So this looked pretty familiar.
It does.
Okay. Now the difference here is that the construction element is the only element that is not grayed out. So that's telling you, as the delegated planner, you have the ability and the responsibility now to go ahead and flesh that out. And again, you could either flesh it out manually, or what I would suggest you do is take advantage of the knowledge library again, and you would do your search and interrogate the knowledge library for a relevant area of knowledge, and you would pull that in, and again, off you go. So at this point, you've committed, again, I think that was 3 mouse clicks. You've built out your construction scope with site access, early works, so on and so forth. And now, as the project owner, if we jump back as me and go back to the defined scope view, I can immediately see there's your scope.
Excellent.
Pretty cool, huh? So fourth and finally, basis dates and planning windows. You may have noticed as I was defining my planning packages that each of the planning packages contains a green target icon at the end of it. Now, the green targets represent a desired completion date for that particular deliverable. Now, what's very, very powerful about these basis dates is that you can define them, you can set them at the planning package level, but then as you flesh out your plan with either additional planning packages, or as we saw earlier, when you convert a planning package to a work package because of activities, basis tracks whether or not the details within that planning package, if the details breach the original basis date, then the basis date icon turns red and you can immediately report the size of the breach, in this example, by 132 days. Now, another type of tracking mechanism is what we call planning windows. So on the right-hand side, we have an example where we have two WBSs, one for procurement, one for construction. Procurement has a planning window defined that perfectly aligns with the start of the WBS and finishes at the end of the WBS. Now, that's different to the construction WBS. The construction WBS also has a planning window defined. You can see that by the red boundary. However, because the planning packages within construction have been elongated and stretched out, they've breached not only the end of the construction scope, but also the beginning as well. Really useful for things such as equipment availability, or perhaps you have tied yourself down contractually with regards to if you're working, an offshore installation campaign and you've contracted for the installation rig to turn up in March and leave in May, then you have that 2-month window. So by defining that 2-month window or representing it as a planning window, again, as you're then building out the plan, you can see whether your execution, your work that you're going to actually perform, how close to breaching that planning window is it? So very quickly, let me show you our fourth and final example of that. So let's go back to our scope view. And to make this very, very simple, I'm going to create a new planning package right at the top here. And again, there's our green target date. And I could move my planning package, change the duration. The basis date moves with it. So let's now create 5 planning packages within there. So Basis was smart enough to say, okay, he asked me to create 5 planning packages in succession. I'm going to equally divide them up and put them in sequence such that we don't breach. Now, again, of course, I could then come along and change my durations, my sequence. And if I were to do that such that this last element here is now later than the original basis date, it shows it as breached.
And it looked like it was a 159-day breach.
Yeah, so actually just by hovering, Paul, it tells me there that I had planned to complete the scope of work on the 29th of July. Because of the push out on that last element, it's now 159 days later, going through to the 4th of January. Correct? Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm okay with that breach and it's reflective of how we're actually going to perform the work, can I reset that basis date in some way?
Of course, yeah. So, and I think that's a very common scenario, because you may start out with your initial target at the summary level. You start to build out your scope elements and you say, you know what, because of the sequence and the durations, I was a little overly optimistic at the summary level. So you can go back to the summary and absolutely reset your basis date, and that then becomes your starting point going forward. So yes.
Okay.
So everything we've looked at so far has literally been in absence of activities, logic links. What we're doing is we're doing top-down planning. We're establishing timelines such that when we get to the next step and we do our building out, of activities, logic, so on and so forth, then we have something to compare against. And that's why we're so passionate about the differentiation between scope and work, because I believe that you have to, first of all, have a big picture view as to how long you expect something to take, but also how tolerant are you about timelines, and then build the work, do the detailed bottoms up, and let's see if the two align. If they don't align, then you either need to accelerate your schedule, perhaps by throwing more resources and or money at the project, or you need to go back to your scope-based, deliverable-based plan and say, you know what, we're being overly optimistic, overly aggressive. I think one of the reasons why projects today are perceived as being late is because we don't go through this initial, let's first of all define realistic expectations and agree on those expectations, again, with our stakeholders, with our joint venture partners. People today dive straight into a CPM tool and start fleshing out activities. Well, that's ridiculous. You don't have a basis against which to measure whether or not that work is in alignment with what is reasonable or not. The fleshing out of the work is the second session, which is scheduled for next week. Again, really just to wrap up with regards to this aspect of scope and deliverables. Really what we're doing is we're setting target execution dates. We're doing that in absence, though, of being skewed by the work. The work comes next. We're gonna build out the work, and then we're gonna see how close the work plan aligns to that deliverable-based plan. And again, as I said, if it doesn't align, then one of two things either have to happen. We have to go back and rework the plan, or our expectations have to be aligned to fit the plan. I think that's a much more effective way of planning than not having that basis or that baseline against which to measure. So next week, we absolutely will be getting into the bottoms-up planning. That's where we take our deliverables, our scope-based plan, and we start to put meat on the bone, as it were. We start to flesh out the schedule. We'll absolutely get into delegating the planning process, because in most projects that we get involved with, of course, there's more than one planner. You know, if you've got thousands or tens of thousands of activities in a schedule, it's not realistic to have a single person fleshing out that plan. So delegation is a very, very key aspect and feature within the Basis product. We'll also introduce a very powerful capability with regards to baselines as well. From that, then we get into the team member markup and review process. But I'm going to hold on explaining too much on that until we get to those subsequent sessions.